Hi, good morning, everybody. So basically, a lot of people say they struggle with the paper 2 essay, which is the international resistance to apartheid. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to explain it in this video, and then I'll upload the video to the Google Classroom, and then you guys can go through it on your own time. Hopefully I can get done in like half an hour because that's how long my free period is. But let's see how I do. I'll also see if I can maybe edit this video and make it like cooler later, so it's easier to remember because you're always constantly seeing these things. I apologize about my eye. I have a bit of a sty, so I'm looking a bit cross-eyed at the moment. But anyway, so basically the civil resistance in South Africa consists of internal and then also international resistance to apartheid. Because the question focus is not on internal resistance, I'm not going to talk about that too much. I'm only going to talk about the international resistance. And before we can speak about the international resistance, we need to know, how did this whole thing come about? Why did people internationally start joining in on the anti-apartheid movement? And really, it starts really getting the ball rolling in the 1980s. Because during the 1980s, there was increasing internal and external pressure against apartheid. The reason for that is that the president at the time, P.W. Botha, was showing an unwillingness to change. He had something called the Rubicon speech, where he basically said, apartheid is here to stay. And people were like, no, that's not going to work. He said that South Africa was experiencing a total onslaught of communism, and there's things happening in the country, these communists are trying to overthrow us and all of these things. So he thought the way to deal with the total onslaught was the total strategy, and it consisted of 2 points. The first point was to reform apartheid, so it looks like there's changes, but there weren't really any changes. And then the second one was to increase resistance against apartheid, so increase oppression, against apartheid. And as a result, people started to, more people going into jail, more riots, more protests, and the police were just very, very brutal during the 1980s. And these things were all broadcasted, like worldwide. I'm sure you guys have heard of the Bang Bang Club that took photos of everything that was happening in apartheid. There were also people that were exiles in the apartheid government, from the apartheid government, like they were members of the ANC, and then they had to basically move overseas, and many of them settled in Britain because Britain has colonial ties to South Africa. So people like Kader Asmal and those kind of people went overseas, and they established an anti-apartheid movement there. So let me just go down here in my notes. And that is basically what started the international resistance to apartheid. So as apartheid was applied more strictly, and we had more people, more protests, more riots, the rest of the world decided they need to do something. As ordinary people, what can we do? And what was decided was that there's calls for sanctions, but places like US, the UN, they wanted this idea of constructive engagement. Just talk to them. Maybe eventually they will wake up and they'll listen. But that wasn't happening, obviously. So then what they did was the anti-apartheid movement was established in Britain, and then there was an extension of it, the Irish anti-apartheid movement, established by Kader Asmal. And their whole idea was that they were going to have a coordinated campaign of boycotts, disinvestments, sanctions, all of those things. They're going to do all of these things at once, because what was happening is that there were little boycotts here and there and sanctions here and there, but it needed to become like a full movement so that the apartheid government would be attacked basically from all sides. So it became quite a powerful international solidarity movement to weaken apartheid. So one of the first things that the international anti-apartheid movement brought about was the IDAF, which is the International Defence and Aid Fund, which meant that South African exiles in Britain and Ireland sent money to liberation movements, to people stuck in prison, political prisoners, and it was all about supporting their families and providing them with legal defense. That money just seemed to come out of nowhere, and the apartheid government now suddenly had these apartheid prisoners that were well represented in court that were not then sent to jail because of the IDAF. However, the IDAF, usually you don't need to speak about it in your essay. The next thing is the 4 different boycotts. So you can basically break it down into sports boycotts, cultural boycotts, academic boycotts, and consumer boycotts. So sports boycotts was one of the first. It started long even before the anti-apartheid movement. You had the boycott movement that then became the anti-apartheid movement. So with the sports boycotts was the idea that internationally, we are not going to allow South Africa to play on an international stage. So things like Olympics, FIFA, these big rugby tours, cricket tours, all of those were off limits for South Africans. And they had things like, I think the example you can use is the Glen Eagles Agreement, which is a call on all Commonwealth countries. So Commonwealth countries are countries which have a connection to Britain. Those countries must not allow South Africa to play sports in their countries. They must cut all sporting ties with South Africa. And the UN also assisted in this regard by compiling a list of people that actually participated in sporting events in South Africa. And these people were then obviously then targeted, like, come on guys, why are you doing this, and this sort of thing. There were massive protests in New Zealand. So when people actually allowed the Springbok team to come and visit, what happened was that ordinary people would then boycott their matches, not go to the matches, protest the very arrival of the Springboks because they don't want them there. What this did essentially was put pressure on the apartheid government, because now sports is stagnating. You can't move any further than where you are, because the reason for you can only compete on a local level, you can't compete on an international level. And so many sporting officials and people that wanted to see these international events, they wanted South Africa to participate in this international event, they joined the anti-apartheid movement, and they apply more pressure on the apartheid government to end apartheid so that they can participate in things like the Olympics and the FIFA and etc. So that's the sports boycotts. The next one I want to speak about is the cultural boycotts. So the cultural boycotts were supported by the United Nations, and essentially what it meant was musicians, actors, people of the dramatic arts basically, they pledged not to work in South Africa. So they would not sell any of their work to South Africa. So like a British TV show could not be played in South Africa during the cultural boycotts. What this did is this essentially isolated South Africa from international media. And the only thing that was allowed was movies that were against apartheid. So one of the examples that you can use is Cry Freedom or Dry White Season, where British producers would say, go and watch those movies. Why? Because those movies portrayed what was happening during apartheid. And suddenly, this foreign media and this local media that tells you about what is happening, suddenly more people become aware of what is happening in South Africa. And as a result, the international community starts joining in on the anti-apartheid movement. So the next one I want to speak about is the academic boycotts. These were a little bit more difficult to implement, simply because, and some people also argue whether it was even successful at all, because all it did was it said that people that participate in universities and they have British scholarships and things like that, they cannot study overseas. People that come from British universities like Oxford University would not come and teach in South Africa. So they refused to collaborate with South African researchers, they refused to publish South African books, they refused to keep international conferences in South Africa, they banned South African delegates, scholars who wanted to travel to South Africa were not allowed to. and universities refused to grant access to South African scholars. Now, the reason why people say it wasn't that successful is because it only really targeted the ordinary people. It didn't really target the government. So the idea was that ordinary people would then in turn place pressure on government to end apartheid. And I suppose you could say it is useful to an extent because it did get more academics on board with the idea of the anti-apartheid movement. But many people argue that it actually hurt people more than it helped them. So you can take that either way. The next one is the consumer boycotts. So the consumer boycotts basically asked people in Britain not to buy South African goods. There was a really big one on, I think, oatspanned fruit, where they didn't buy fruit from South Africa. And obviously this had an effect on farmers because if they can't sell their produce, what's going to happen? The produce is going to rot. So they basically had no choice but to then pressurize the government to end apartheid. So some people say that it had varied success, but the combined influence of the consumer boycotts along with things like the disinvestments and the sanctions, that threatened the profits of company. And you know how to make someone listen is you take their money, right? So these businesses then applied pressure on government to introduce reforms so that people can start buying their things again. In 1977, the US government put forward the Sullivan Principle, which basically just said that if your people are not treated equally, we're not going to invest with you, we're not going to trade with you. So as a result, it made it very difficult for South African companies to operate under the Sullivan Principle because obviously legally they weren't permitted to treat people equally, meaning they now no longer have access to that trade from the United States, which creates financial pressure on the apartheid government. Then let me speak about the sanctions and the boycotts. So let me just go up to my notes. So basically the anti-apartheid movement launched a campaign on oil, and they targeted Shell and BP so that the cost of oil becomes very expensive in South Africa. That will push more ordinary people to start protesting. You know, when the petrol price goes higher, people start protesting because higher petrol prices means higher food prices, means higher everything. So by launching a campaign, basically putting sanctions on oil, meaning the price is going up, that is how they put pressure on the apartheid government. The next thing was the campaign against Barclays Bank, which you will hear in any video that speaks about this particular topic, which is Barclays Bank was actually one of the biggest banks at the time. And they were eventually put under so much pressure that they had to withdraw from South Africa. Their ordinary account holders were told, cut your accounts with Barclays Bank, withdraw your money from Barclays Bank. And as a result, they had to, in order to get people to stop leaving their company, they had to withdraw from South Africa. This had an incredibly big effect because lots of other countries, I think up to 40 or 50 other companies started to pull out of South Africa, and they stopped investing in South Africa as well because of the sanction campaign. And once again, this places economic strain on the apartheid government. So they also put sanctions on South African products, meaning large chain stores. So like in South Africa, we would consider a chain store something like Woolworths, like you've got a Woolworths in Cape Town or Woolworths in Johannesburg. Now in Britain, they have something called Sainsbury's. Now Sainsbury's were targeted by the sanction campaign, and they were told, do not buy South African products. And because they didn't buy South African products, suddenly, once again, putting pressure on the apartheid government towards reform, towards change. In addition to that, you had the anti-apartheid movement and the National Union of Mine Workers that put together a ban of South African coal. So now we can't sell our coal overseas either, which means we're sitting with all this coal that we can't sell. Once again, putting economic pressure on the country. Right, so I think that is it for the sanctions. Let's go to the disinvestments. I think I kind of mixed up the sanctions and disinvestments a little bit, but okay. Disinvestments. So anti-apartheid feelings continued to grow, and with it came disinvestments. So what that meant is that places like Barclays Bank and Kodak, and I think Polaroid as well, basically they stop investing in South Africa. Boycotts of South African goods increase, and South African export trade is suffering. And the reason why this was so devastating was that the South African government at this time was under increasing economic pressure because of obviously the boycotts, the sanctions, all of those are now compiling, it's becoming more and more. And if they don't have that international capital, then unfortunately that means that South Africa would face a major economic collapse. They'll lose a lot of money. And that would have resulted in job losses, it would have resulted in unrest. So they basically had no choice but to try and get these guys to invest again. And the way to do that was obviously to change the apartheid system, to end the apartheid system. Next, we had the release of political prisoners. It's also known as the Free Mandela campaign, where the anti-apartheid movement strived to make Mandela a household name. Because at this moment, not a lot of people overseas really knew or cared about what was happening in South Africa. So they decided they needed a face. They needed someone that people could look at and then associate that person with the anti-apartheid movement. And they used Mandela because I think Mandela was the leader of the ANC at the time, and he had been in prison for a very long time as well. So he just seemed like the perfect candidate for them. And what they did was that they sent up a Release Mandela committee in London, and they led multiple campaigns. So there was a concert in Wembley. They named a particle after him, the Mandela particle. They had that a film about Nelson Mandela. They made a song called Free Nelson Mandela. So as a result, Nelson Mandela kind of becomes an international household name. Even if they don't know about people like Oliver Tambo or Govan Mbeki, everybody knew who Nelson Mandela was. And in knowing about Nelson Mandela, they in turn had to learn about apartheid. And the point of this was that it created more and more people joining the anti-apartheid movement, applying more pressure on the apartheid government to end. The last thing I'm going to talk about is the Frontline States, so the countries that surround South Africa. Now, up until I think about the 1960s, 1950s, many of these countries were colonial, so they were basically controlled by a European country. And then around the 1950s, they started to get their independence. And once they got their independence, they immediately began to house exiles from South Africa. So people that were chased out of South Africa by the apartheid government, people that no longer had a place in South Africa because they were banned or they would have been killed or assassinated, they could have set up a base in one of those border frontline states. So for example, things like places like Botswana, places like Lesotho, places like Namibia, they could set up a base there. But unfortunately, many of these frontline states were economically dependent on South Africa, so they couldn't be open with their support of the ANC and the PAC and the liberation movement. However, eventually, I think it was Angola and Mozambique, they basically allowed military bases of the ANC and the PAC to be established there, which meant that now the South Africans were getting training in terms of military, they were getting armor, they were getting weapons from the Soviet Union. So now they can actually start fighting back with a coordinated attack method rather than just these random militias, guerrilla warfare that was currently happening. And as a result, the South African Defense Force had to launch raids into Angola to kind of kill this movement. However, turns out these raids were very expensive to carry out, and with the financial pressure of the boycotts, the sanctions, the disinvestments, all of that all together, it was actually too much. They couldn't afford it anymore. And as a result, they were basically forced to go towards the negotiation table. So this all coincided with internal resistance, which I didn't speak about. So within the country, people were also protesting, boycotting, rioting, etc. So you can't fight a war on two fronts. It was too much. And as a result, South Africans were forced towards negotiations between the NP government and the ANC, which eventually led to FW de Klerk unbanning parties like the ANC, the PAC, and the SACP, and releasing Nelson Mandela. And the next 4 years was a very difficult process of negotiations, which is the next unit, which I'm not going to be covering in this video. And only in 1994 did all South Africans get the right to vote in the first democratic elections. So I hope this video helps. It basically explains how the international anti-apartheid movement led to changes in South Africa, or created changes in South Africa. I apologize if there are any inaccuracies. This is all based on my own research and things that I got off the internet and things that I got from textbooks and everything all together, and some of my own knowledge as well that I've applied. But it should more or less be okay. Hopefully, if you watch this video, you'll understand the entire unit. Thanks, bye.